creation of a normative order in order to submit or to subject, that is the better term, subject the individual to the specific laws of that normative order. Yeah, so I'm called into the normative order I'm assigned a place according to Althusser in that normative order. And now Sandner's, I think, very interesting and promising reflections is to say that this act of interpellation that calls me in a normative order always presupposes an act of calling, which he calls a command, that is not the placement in a specific normative order, but rather calls me into a relation to a normative order, that demands from me not to do something specific, namely follow a specific law, but being open to normative calls as such. So before I'm called into a specific normative orders, I have to be opened up as an individual to being receptive for normative claims at all. So that is what Sandner's remarks, Sandner's reflection. So there's a presupposition inscribed in the logic of interpellation, which is precisely not the closing, not the inscription of the individual into a closed normative order, but quite to the contrary, the opening up of the individual to normative claims as such. So, maybe do I have 5 minutes more, so just to finish, okay. So if the calling of the other forms the forgotten beginning of subjectivation, then this calling can also occur again after subjectivation in Althusser's sense has taken place. The commandment can be repeated when the individual has already entered the social order and become a subject. Then the commandment calls us out of the social order into which the Althusser interpellation has called me. This makes the second commandment, the commandment for the second time, the commandment of liberation. Hearing the commandment the second time, so when I'm already in a normative order, I hear the command to enter the normative order again. If I hear it the second time, hearing it once again and recognizing its demand, therefore, also means, as Sandner says, a second birth of the individual. Not the birth of the social person as the individual instantiation of the universal, but the birth, as he says, Sandner says, with Rosenzweig, of the meta-ethical self as singular from its social existence as a person. The recognition of the call by the other thus only becomes liberation when it has been forgotten into participation in social recognition. In the beginning, when the individual is first struck by the hailing of the other, it was not yet liberating. Here the hailing is an act of pure violence. For the individual, it is merely an interruption of her natural functioning, and its recognition is therefore merely an act of subjection. But when the subject, who has become part of the social order, hears the call of the other for the second time, when the commandment is repeated in the social order, it reminds her of what she has been, not a subject, but the transition from individual to subject, from nature to society, or the scene of the difference. The recognition of the other is here the recognition of one's own non-identity. Now one could ask, but who is the other who has the power to repeat the command of subjectivation? Who can call me in that way? Who can confront me with a command that has that liberating force? Where does this second calling and liberating recognition come from? What Althusser said about the hailing that turns the individual into a social subject also applies to the second command, whose recognition signifies the second birth of the self. That it can only take place through the capital other subject with a capital S. But who, we could ask, occupies this place and who embodies this authority? This question has not yet been decided. In the first hailing, it must be someone who can assume the position of unconditional authority for an individual, which can therefore also be called sovereign. In the second calling, however, it must be someone who has the power to challenge the subject to go back to its beginning and repeat its own history once again. But this, I want to say, this other, this capital other, whose voice has a liberating force for me, this other can be anyone. Anyone can become the commanding other. Liberation thus takes place precisely in the field of those relationships in which social recognition establishes a normative order of equality under laws between the one and the other. Every other who is an equal social part in this order can become an other or the other with a capital O, who commands one from outside or above to repeat the beginning of one's subjectivation. Every other can be the other through whose recognition the self is liberated. Just a last brief remark. The recognition of the other, again with the capital O, is precisely liberating by being a relation of inequality. This is what I try to show. It is not yet a social relation, the social recognition that constitutes the subject and society in the way in which Hornet has explained it for us. At the same time, however, this relation of inequality to the other, and that is the relation for which Levinas recommends to reserve the term religion. So this relation of inequality to the other opens up a space of radical equality. An equality beyond social participation and membership, a relation of equality which goes beyond the social spheres of mutual recognition. It is true that the recognition of otherness is a relation between unequals. The one who recognizes and the other whom she recognizes are, as Derrida put it, wholly other. Again, they are totally, absolutely, radically, infinitely other. Unquote. This separates them from social recognition, in which reciprocity means the sameness of both the acts and the subject of recognition. So again, let me remind you of that important quote from Hegel. Each sees the other do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. That is the equality scene of social recognition. But if at the same time every other can be the other, capital O, that liberates the self, then recognizing the other means understanding its otherness as that of everyone and anyone. It means, I quote again from Derrida, linking alterity to singularity. The formulation that every other is or can be the other, Derrida says, tout autre et tout autre, seals, he says, the contract between universality and the exception of singularity. The recognition of the other always takes place in the singular, in the recognition of the otherness of this other. But because it is not the recognition of the singular as particular, i.e. as the particular instantiation of the social generality, it is absolutely universal in its indeterminacy. There is no condition for being the liberating other. Nothing qualifies for it. All singular and thus singularizing acts of liberating recognition are therefore interconnected. Every single act is like all the others, every single other like every other single other. They are equal in being completely different. This is their unity, or for their community, the community of singulars who can be liberating others for each other. Thank you for your patience. I hope you could follow what I said. The question part of the intervention was about the relation, a more precise analysis of the relation between these three concepts of recognition. But the intervention also made a suggestion to which I will come maybe in a moment, which is very interesting and too rich to be addressed here. So let me begin with the question of the relation between these three three conceptions, dimensions, vectors, I've called it in the title, of recognition. Of course, they're not simply standing in a relation of mutual against, or what is that, substitution, enriching each other. Of course, Althusser and Honneth also come to very different understandings of the normative order of a society. When I said that we nevertheless should try to read them as addressing two perspectives that we have to think together, I wanted to say that the one question is the question that Honneth answers. That is the question of which I have called the constitutive logic of recognition. So here recognition is the process of constituting a society and thereby subjectivity. Althusser answers a different question, first of all. I think that is important to see. He answers not the question of the constitution of subjectivity in a society, but of the question of formation and the genesis of society and subjectivity. That is a different question. So that is what I basically wanted to say. And of course, if you enter the whole debate from answering the one question or answering the other question, you also get different views of what subjectivity and society are. But I wanted to convince you in a certain sense that we have to think about both questions together. So, and take them seriously, independently from each other, the formation question and the constitution question, and not reduce the one question to the other, which I think is mostly done. So that is just a clarification. Now the third dimension, the third concept of recognition, which I took from Eric Sandner, I think, Herr Balzaretti, you're totally right. I mean, that changes something in our account of society. This is what I tried to indicate at the end. Because it says that if the opening up to the unconditional call, the infinite call of normativity, of normative demands, if that opening up takes place in the social relation between me and you and me, then social relations are understood differently. Social relations are not about the mutual confirmation of our identities, as one could maybe understand or misunderstand on it, but rather social relations are about challenging each other's identity by infinite demands. So it changes the concept this changes our understanding of what the social scene of mutual relations between subjects are. What else can I say? And I'm not sure what the right term is I think if I understood you correctly, I mean, the acoustic is not very good, as you also will notice. If I understood you correctly, you suggested the term love or Liebe for it. So at the end of my talk, I took up another term, but I'm not very happy with it, namely a different understanding of what community could mean. But the community not in the German sense of Gemeinschaft, so which means sharing heritage, sharing values, sharing a faith or so, but the community of alternative clarity. Okay, let me stop here. So I wanted to clarify this question, this methodological question maybe of the talk. I mean, so that on the one side, I think we need to understand these three vectors of recognition as always being co-present, as working together in the formation of subjectivity, but that means at the same time that they stand in a relation of tension with each other, and that tension can be productive in transforming what subjectivity and society means. Ich antworte, glaube ich, auf Deutsch und ich versuche das dann kurz zu übersetzen für diejenigen, für die das angucken.
So brauchen Sie nicht zu übersetzen, ja. Entweder eine Sprache oder die andere. Beide sind also gleich, wie gesagt, am Anfang, ja.
Okay, alles klar, danke. Ja, beides ganz wunderbare und sehr tiefgehende Fragen, die ich glaube ich jetzt gar nicht, ich bin sicher gar nicht richtig und schon gar nicht angemessen aufnehmen kann. Ich glaube, bei der ersten Frage steht ein Problem im Raum, das ich nur benennen will, weil ich es jetzt nicht auf die Schnelle lösen kann. Nämlich, dass ich am Anfang nur kurz angedeutet habe, und dass ich also vor allem in meinem Honnet-Teil ausführlicher diskutieren müsste. Nämlich, was ist das Verhältnis zwischen dem, was ich den konstitutiven oder ontologischen Sinn von Anerkennung genannt habe, und den normativen Sinn, an den Sie auch jetzt nochmal erinnert haben. Ja? Gegenseitige Anerkennung, glaube ich, der Begriff ist systematisch zweideutig. Ja? Man könnte sagen, es gibt überhaupt keine Gesellschaft, gar keine menschliche Gesellschaft, in dem nicht insofern gegenseitige Anerkennung wirksam ist, als wir überhaupt nur miteinander eine Gesellschaft bilden, sofern wir uns gegenseitig als Mitglieder dieser Gesellschaft anerkennen. Ja, und das ist eine basale Hinsicht von Gleichheit, nämlich Mitgliedschaft in einer Gesellschaft. Also das Verhältnis von Herr und Sklave, zumindest in einer bestimmten Auffassung, ist keine gegenseitige Anerkennung, weil sie auch gar keine gemeinsame Gesellschaft bilden. Ja, der Sklave ist nicht Teil der Gesellschaft. Das Verhältnis von Mann und Frau in Griechenland, ein Verhältnis extremer Hierarchie und Asymmetrie, ist ein gesellschaftliches Verhältnis, weil sie beide gleichermaßen Mitglieder der Gesellschaft sind. Ja. Das ist zunächst mal der ontologische Sinn, an den ich erinnern wollte. Und jetzt haben Sie vollkommen recht. In der modernen Sittlichkeit wird diese fundamentale Gleichheit der Mitgliedschaft einer Gesellschaft normativ egalitär, könnte man sagen, gedeutet. Ja, was die traditionelle nicht wurde. Traditionell war die Gleichheit der Mitgliedschaft vereinbar mit radikaler Hierarchie, Autoritätsdifferenzen und so weiter und so weiter. Und die sehr interessante Frage, die Sie aufwerfen, zu der ich aber gar keine Antwort habe, ist, wie muss man diesen Modernisierungsschritt verstehen, ja, in der aus der ontologischen Gleichheit der Anerkennung eine normative Gleichheit wird? Ja, was ist das für ein Lernschritt? Ja, und der scheint mir nicht ganz einfach zu verstehen sein. Wir können, glaube ich, nicht sagen, dass die traditionelle Gesellschaft einfach zu dumm war, die normativen Konsequenzen aus der ontologischen Gleichheit zu ziehen, sondern hier geschieht so etwas Innovatives. Ja, die Moderne hat gemacht einen innovativen Zug der ontologischen Gleichheit, der gegenseitigen Anerkennung, einen tiefen normativen, radikal normativen Sinn gibt. Ja, daran haben Sie, glaube ich, zu Recht erinnert. Und das würde heißen, eine Geschichte zu schreiben, ja, so genau wie Sie gesagt haben. Meine Frage ist, glaube ich, mit der Genealogie ein bisschen eine andere, das habe ich wahrscheinlich auch jetzt nicht in der Schnelle gut genug erläutert. Ich wollte mich fragen, unter Genealogie meinte ich nicht diese Art der radikal normativen Deutung oder Neudeutung von Gesellschaftlichkeit in der Moderne, sondern ich meinte den Prozess der Formierung von Subjektivität, der in jedem Einzelnen von uns stattgefunden hat. Mit Genealogie meine ich, mit Genese meine ich der Prozess, der stattgefunden hat, der uns von einem Neugeborenen, das noch nicht mal schreien konnte, zu einem sprechfähigen, handlungsfähigen und so weiter Subjekt gemacht hat. Ja, das meine ich mit Genealogie. Und ich glaube, diese beiden Untersuchungsprogramme, das von Ihnen skizzierte, einer Historiografie, ja, der modernen Normativität und das von mir erinnerte, einer Genealogie der Subjektformierung, die schließen sich überhaupt nicht aus, ja, sondern die stehen zunächst mal auf eine interessante Weise nebeneinander und ihr Verhältnis ist komplex. Ja. Also das als Versuch einer Antwort auf die erste als Antwort, eine Bemerkung zur ersten Ausführung. Das zweite ist eine sehr interessante Frage. Gesetz zu die Notenzeit, die Band stellt sich zusammen mit der Differenz von Unmenschlichkeit. Also ich verkürze jetzt sehr, aber ich glaube, es war ein Aspekt. Ich glaube, ich weiß es nicht. Ich glaube, ich weiß es nicht. Ich bin mir nicht ganz sicher. Ich will nur, vielleicht darf ich Sie kurz erinnern oder kurz einfach schildern, woran, an welcher Szene ich mir diese Differenz versucht habe klarzumachen. Und dann kann man darüber nachdenken, ob das mit Moralität gut gefasst ist. Ich glaube, Rosenzweig, also in dem Stern der Erlösung, das ist ja sein nachhegelianisches Buch, ja, nach dem Bruch mit der Hegelschen Philosophie. Ja. Als er diese Differenz einführt, an zentrale Szenen der biblischen Geschichte. Ja? Und eine zentrale Szene ist die der Anrufung von Moses nach dem brennenden Dornbusch. Ja? Als Gott Moses anruft und ihn dann in der Folge dazu auffordert, zum Befreier seines Volkes zu werden, es aus Ägypten herauszuführen. Und dieser Anruf, diese Anrufung, die Sentner auch analysiert oder auf die er sich bezieht, besteht eigentlich nur in einem Wort. Ja, Gott sagt zu Mose, er sagt Moses nicht, tu das, tu jenes, sondern sagt nur Mose. Er ruft den Namen Mose und das ist das Gebot. Ja, weil das Gebot besteht nur darin, aufgefordert zu werden, den Ruf zu hören. Ja, das meinte ich vorher damit. Es ist die Norm der Normativität, das Gesetz der Gesetzmäßigkeit. Es ist noch nicht das inhaltlich bestimmte Gesetz, sondern es ist nur das Gesetz, werde jemand, der nicht nur an sich selbst denkt, der nicht nur seine Schafe hütet, der sich nicht nur um seine Familie kümmert, sondern der bereit ist, den Ruf zu hören, das Gebot zu hören. Und das ist das, was ich mit Gebot meine. Und jetzt frage ich Sie einfach, gebe ich Ihnen die Frage zu, ist das dasselbe mit Moralität? Ich bin mir nicht sicher.
State power, we established the name state power in all Washington receives wealth, and insofar as this are external signs of service and loyalty, this wealth represents an essential aspect of the moral consciousness. By contrast, base consciousness scorns both state power and wealth. It sees in sovereign power a fetter and suppression of its own being for itself, and therefore pays the role, obeys only with a secret malice, and is always on the point of revolt. Thus, the base consciousness knows loyalty and policy power and contempt. Its attitude toward wealth is no different. In the enjoyment of its wealth, it becomes conscious of itself merely as an idealistic individual, conscious only of a transitory enjoyment, loving with hating wealth. At the same time, the relation to wealth demonstrates the patronizing attitude of the sovereign who believes that he can buy the loyalty. Thus, the noble consciousness becomes estranged from the state power, since it sees that the state power is not grounded on any particular principle of pride, but rather rests on the simple will of the individual, the king. The courtier becomes the haughty vassal, a cynical servant of the state. Noble consciousness also understands that while he depends on the monarch for his wealth, his self-perception is dependent on something external and not individual. That's the noble consciousness collapses and disrupted, and once again it is transformed into its opposite, the base one. The end result of this form of historical movement of the spirit is that the noble consciousness is transformed into a cynical, self-contradictory consciousness. The good has become the bad, the noble has become the base, there remains nothing so. The alienated courtier becomes the nephew of Lamour, who criticizes everything, including the court culture, but still he remains part of this culture. He still plays the role. Rameau performs his beggar's pantomime, dependent on the monarch for his livelihood. The noble consciousness is reduced to the same status as the base consciousness, and the world where the wealth rules, where those with riches support that they have procured another self for the gift of the meal and remain oblivious to the seething resentment and bearish suppressed rebellion of those they have allegedly purchased. Only the torn portions speak the truth. This reading, or let's say this German interpretation of the text of Diderot by Hegel, I think is by choosing the choice of this text. I don't think it's an accident. There is a fleeting remark of a recent commentator of Hegel's phenomenology that Diderot's present text could have been substituted by many others, including Proof, and I don't think it's completely fair. This text of Diderot is revolutionary in several respects. In one respect, it's definitely very novel. In it, we see the birth of the modern concept of cynicism, as it is explicitly opposed to the older concept of cynicism. As Klaus Heinrich tells us, the old cynicism, clinical philosophy, was a revolt against society, whereas the modern cynicism is characterized by the resignation of the space. And Rameau's nephew resigns himself by explicitly opposing himself to the Ionic dimensions. Well, there is another text where the birth of this modern form of cynicism another way of existence. And this birth of modern cynicism actually also entirely modern form of ressentiment, the word occurs many times in the text in everyday sense, but we should not forget that it was Diderot who wrote the entry for the word ressentiment in the encyclopedia. His concept does not reach the depth of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, but the way he described Rameau's entry and bio over his superiors, we can say without any illusion that this text made a significant contribution to the description of the phenomenon. As I just expressed, a man from the other. Now I would like to say a couple of words about what these two texts can teach us about our faith. When I say the present faith, I mean has implications globally. Since Hegel describes in this Geistkampf, Gestalt des Geistes, formations of spirit, let's attempt to describe a new Gestalt, which we observe with our own eyes during the last 2 or 3 decades. Now I'll become political. I call this new Gestalt Russia today. And by Russia today, I don't mean only Russia as a country. I also mean, ironically, their TV channel, which is, as you know, is broadcast only in foreign languages, not in Russian. It's not destined for the Russian population. It was to spread the message across the world. And I think that we can learn a lot about this present Gestalt if we apply the conclusions we draw from Diderot's and Hegel's texts. But first I have to tell you 2 anecdotes. First anecdote links two periods directly with each other. In 2014, each governor of Russia, the Russian Federation, received a New Year present from the president. It was a package of philosophy books. All of them were by Russian philosophers, and first among them was the volume of Ivan Ilyin, called Philosophy of Inequality. Of course, there was comedy. As a result, some governors hired philosophy tutors in order to be able to discuss the philosophical topics with the president during the next meeting. But the importance of Ilyin should be noted. There is an official philosopher of the current Russian regime, and one would be surprised to learn that Ilyin was a Hegelian. He was a in German called Hegel, published a very significant book on the doctrine of Hegel, the conflicts between God and men. And he adopted a certain right-wing interpretation of Hegel, which fused with the Russian nation's autocratic context, and rejection of liberalism, criticism of individualism, which is definitely far more radical than Hegel ever indulged in, and the promotion of Russia's spiritual essence as opposed to the Western civilization. This links, so to say, the Hegelian topics, Hegelian heritage, unfortunately in a very caricatural way, to the current Russian ideology of the regime. But there is another anecdote which links, hopefully, this two periods in a more general fashion. And well-informed journalists tell us as a story that Putin entered one of his ministers by telling him that he should not believe all this American European talk about democracy, because it's nothing but a smokescreen. If he wants to really understand how politics function in the West, he should watch 2 US TV series, The House of Cards and The Boss. Now, if you really watch those series, it's very ironic because you will easily grasp that both of them are transposition of Shakespearean plays. I don't think they taught war literature in Hegel schools, but if they had, you would have recognized the House of Cards as transposition of Macbeth and the Boss's transposition of that this attitude of Putin shows the same mixture of resentment and cynicism which we saw in the text of Diderot. Resentment is, of course, directed against the West, which holds itself as a shining example of human rights and free elections, and criticizing those regimes which are not upholding these substantive principles. And the cynicism is a claim of privileged knowledge of how things really are behind the curtain. That is, of course, in this particular case, we see the irony of it, but we also see something far more essential. When Putin looks at Shakespearean plays, warrior settings, and thinks it is about the West, it is actually about this Gestaltes Geistes, which I call Russia today, because the major type of challenge these regimes encounter is the challenge of succession, is the challenge of transfer of power, which was the major challenge in early modern Europe. Also during the Louis XIV's or absolutist regimes, etc. With the introduction of universal and regular elections, this problem was solved in Europe, but what I call Russia today, and this can apply to Russia, it can apply to Hungary, it can apply to Georgia, and America, both North and South. This challenge of transfer of power remains fundamental. And it would perhaps here seem natural to involve also the rise of capitalism as a common factor between the 18th century France and the post-Soviet Russia. This would be right Lukash's reading of phenomenology, which fixes capitalism as the some ultimate truth of this chapter I am speaking about, but it could sound strange. I would abstain from this conclusion because the rise of capitalism was not accompanied everywhere with this concomitant rise of authoritarianism, resentment, and cynicism. Thus, invoking simply capitalism would not be enough. We would have to analyze different forms capitalist development took in different times and places and what to do with this new gestalt of the world, where to read it, what is the equivalent of Diderot's model for Russia today? Well, of course, the discourse of the political elite has been exemplified in their statements, contemporary Russian literature, in-depth the fixation of popular trends in the novels of someone like Levin, or journalistic accounts of its description in the books and articles. The mixture of cynicism and resentment, which produce conspiratorial knowledge, which claims to be the real knowledge about the world, almost understood and truth out there, and the unwillingness of the political elite and the inability of the civil society to effect the transfer of power. That would be the major characteristic traits of this gestalt. And when asked what should be done about it by those who see the connection, first term that springs to mind is enlightenment. Enlightenment is what comes after this subsection in Hegel's phenomenology, and enlightenment is what very often is involved in current times. So it's both in the sense of a certain epoch of European history, which took its name from a philosophical movement that had its distinct flag on the origin of knowledge based on ethical and political ideals and ideas, but it also is a program or a project, as Habermas would say, which still goes on. Well, Hegel has a far more critical relation to enlightenment rather than wish, but raise something which I find extremely important in Hegel, in Hegel's understanding of enlightenment, and this is the idea that this project of radical knowledge should free the world from the chains of despotism, superstition, and ignorance. Because all these three are based not on violence and material interest simply, but on a false consciousness, which should be transformed. It is also it could be somehow relevant that in those later years there have been more and more attempts to revive the Enlightenment projects under the name of the Radical Enlightenment, Enlightenment Now, the New Enlightenment, and the Kantian version of Enlightenment, which retained its inspirational character, Sapere Aude, is unfortunately too individualistic in its form, relies too much on individuals' rationality, and confronted with this onslaught of information in the digital era, it looks less and less attractive and more problematic. And Hegel's idea of knowledge as a communal practice seems to be here especially relevant and promising. Practice of enlightenment and institutions of enlightenment, primarily the university, should take up this impulse not only to understand the new world, but also attempt to transform it into this understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. We have now switched to
Vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Ich muss auf Deutsch sprechen, weil das ein bisschen kompliziert ist. Ich habe Teile nicht ganz verstanden aufgrund sprachlicher Probleme, aber zum Schluss haben Sie ein Problem aufgegriffen, das meiner Meinung nach problematisch ist für das Verhältnis zu Hegel selbst. Nämlich, wir müssen wissen, Hegel kann sich gegen die Interpretation seiner Nachlebenden nicht mehr wehren. Was wir von Hegel haben, das sind seine Texte als Dokumente der Historia, die sehr gut gesichert sind, und wir können uns darüber verständigen, was damit gemeint ist, was Hegel vielleicht hätte gemeint haben können, aber wir können das einfach nicht mehr sagen, was Hegel tatsächlich gedacht hat. Und deswegen ist der Missbrauch mit Hegel sehr wohlfeil. Sie haben Putin genannt, und offensichtlich ist in Russland so die Tendenz, wo immer mal den Hegel, der hat da irgendwas geschrieben, vielleicht sogar noch über einen anderen, nämlich gegen Rom, und da ist ein Argument drin, das können wir für unsere Welt gebrauchen, wenn den Ausdruck gebraucht, Gestalt der Welt. Und diese Möglichkeit des Missbrauchs, die ist ständig gegeben. Ich habe in einem Vortrag ja versucht deutlich zu machen, dass Lenin an Hegel ein gespaltenes Interesse gehabt hat. Nämlich einmal war Hegel der Idealist, auf der nur lügen konnte, also sozusagen die Quelle des ganzen Idealismus im 19. Jahrhundert, auf den Lenin, der dann so richtig eingeschlagen hat. Auf der anderen Seite war Lenin an Hegel interessiert, an einem ganz eng begrenzten Teil, nämlich die Dialektik als Methode. Und die hat er natürlich dann ausgenutzt, und im Grunde genommen wurde das simplifiziert auf das Schema. Wir haben eine These, wir haben eine Antithese, wir haben eine Synthese, und alles entwickelt sich zum Besten. Und irgendwann am Ende steht dann großartig, so wurde mir das im Juni erklärt. Also man kann zum Schluss
Vielen Dank. Ich kann dir nur zustimmen. Es ist aber natürlich auch so, dass wir Hegel, wie auch jeden anderen Philosophen lesen, um was daraus zu gewinnen. Es ist nicht nur eine philologische Tätigkeit, nicht wahr? Obwohl natürlich philologische Tätigkeit kommt zuerst als erster Schritt, aber man müsste versuchen, dann natürlich auch pragmatisch weil es die Texte sind natürlich, die die Modelle des Denkens und des Verständnisses bieten, und da meine ich nicht nur Hegel, sondern auch Diderot, die unüberbietbar sind. Zwar, wenn man wirklich sie genau studiert, man entdeckt Reichtum, der eigentlich anderswo nicht zu finden ist. Was die Fehlinterpretationen angeht, besonders im heutigen Russland, die sind nicht unbedingt jetzt aufregend.
Can you all understand me if you give me a sign? Okay, thank you. Accounts of the intellectual influence of Hegel's political philosophy in the 19th century typically recount how his followers and disciples divided into two groups, each with deeply opposed political sympathy. According to this standard narrative, the right Hegelians continued the political thought of the master as project of restoration, invoking state authority and the necessity of traditional times. The left Hegelians, by contrast, took over his dialectical method as their model and used it to demonstrate the necessity of a revolutionary upheaval of existing relations. On this account, both parties, the followers of Karl Rosenkranz on the one hand and the group around Bruno Bauer and Karl Marx on the other, could find sufficient points of orientation in Hegel's work to justify their respective views with reference to his texts. Hegel did seem to have made the case for a strong authoritarian state in his philosophy of right, yet at the same time his dialectic also suggested the necessity of overcoming of all internally ruptured socially unreconciled relations. Yet in my view, this picture of a split amongst Hegel's disciples into two opposed factions, conservative and revolutionary, is misleading and false. It conceals how, besides these two currents, there was also a mediating and equally influential tradition in which Hegel's political thought was developed in the direction of a reformist rather than revolutionary socialist. In what follows, I will try to make good on this claim and show that there was indeed such a third way of inheriting Hegel's political philosophy. Doing so, however, immediately involves confronting a difficulty which does not arise to the same extent than looking at the other two standard groupings. These latter schools of thought were in close contact with one another. They set about the task of preserving those elements of Hegel's political philosophy that they deemed relevant to the future in a fairly cooperative manner. The same cannot be said for the third current, however. Its representatives neither knew one another particularly well, nor did they share similar background assumptions. They did not, therefore, really form a school in the true sense of the word, a group of like-minded, kindred spirits. Instead, they formed a loose, geographically distributed network of social theorists and philosophers, and only now, looking back over a century later, can we really say that they share a common goal, namely of opposing the liberal socialism as an alternative. to both right and left hegemony. This means, however, that an adequate examination of Hegel's influence on political thought requires adopting a wider perspective, one that allows us to discover connections to his concepts even amongst what initially seemed to be quite disparate, disparate theoretical approaches. If we want to explore potential future developments of the ideas contained within Hegel's philosophy of right, we need to be aware of how its proposals and arguments were developed by thinkers who had few intellectual commonalities beyond their relation to the text of the great German idealists. But if we take up this broader view, it is then not so difficult, in fact, to discern the common aim that united the efforts of a seemingly disparate range of authors working at different times and places, namely of taking up Hegel's legacy to further the project of a self-consciously reformist socialism. I want to begin my attempt at casting new light on Hegel's legacy for political philosophy by considering an author who was very close to Hegel personally, namely Eduard Ganz. Ganz belonged neither to the conservative nor to the revolutionary wing of his disciples, but instead tried to forge his own path in inheriting the thought of his teacher. After briefly explaining the extent to which his work sought to combine Hegel's political philosophy with the efforts of early French socialism, I then went on to move on to considering the political philosophy of the British idealists. In the writings of Bernard Bossaket, T.H. Green, and F.H. Bradley, we also find attempts, I will show, to develop Hegel's thought in the direction of a liberal socialism. The final figure I want to consider, but I'm not considering today because it would become too long, to making my case is the French sociologist Emile Durkheim. Even if his mature social theory betrays only very indirect Hegel influences, it can still be considered a milestone in the history of attempts to outline a socialist program on the basis of Hegel's model of society. As we shall see, each of the forces take up very different elements of Hegel's social and political philosophy in grounding their own socialist ideas. It is only by gaining a systematic overview of all the three approaches that we will be able to identify the foundational assumptions and cornerstones of the socialist development of Hegel's political philosophy. So I start with Eduard Ganz. In the decades after Hegel's death, not a few of his followers in Germany were dissatisfied with the emerging split between a reactionary and a revolutionary wing. Those in these circles saw in Hegel's legacy neither a recommendation of conformity to the Russian state, nor a dialectical program conceiving social change in general on the model of a revolutionary supersession of given social relations. Rather, these thinkers, foremost amongst them Lorenz von Stein, favored the gradual realization of the rights of all citizens to political participation through the incremental establishment of a rudimentary social state. This is all well known. For Eduard Ganz, the student of Hegel's and editor of what remains the standard edition of his philosophy of right, this solution to contemporary social changes, rights derived from the deviated concept of right, was insufficiently far-reaching. For Ganz, the key problem of the age was not the failure to realize basic rights in the political realm, but the fact that the condition of the working classes in the economic realm represented the diametrical opposite of those rights' normative promise of social freedom. For this condition was one of poverty, immiseration, and the deprivation of rights completely. Ganz thereby placed the fate of the rebel, a social group given only desultory treatment by his teacher, at the center of his political thought. And in the 1830s, he presently anticipated what would soon become the social question, debated with such already occupied with the possibility of institutions that within the economic sphere itself would overcome the ever-widening social division between a small class of the owners of the means of production and a growing class of property-based earners. It was in the context of these reflections that his sights fell on Paris, a city he loved and visited frequently. For it was here that the social movement, namely symbolism, had formed that, like Hegel and Kant, urged the transition of the capitalist market system towards a more heavily socialized economic order that would serve the common good. Not that Kant agreed with all these Simonist reform proposals, but the few elements of their program that he appropriated sufficed to make him the first and for a time the only representative of a program that mediated between Hegel's political philosophy and early socialism. In order to understand the motivation behind this rapprochement, it is worth first taking a brief look at the chapter on civil society in Hegel's philosophy of life. For in this chapter, Hegel attempted to think of the market economy as an intermediary member of a complex of ethical institutions serving the actualization of social freedom in modern society. In this famous chapter, as you know, called Civil Society, or the realm of needs, which is of somewhat limited scope, Hegel undertakes the difficult task of showing that despite its multiple disruptive forces, the emerging market economy should be understood as an organ of the institutionalized ethical life of modern societies, serving the benefits of all citizens. In doing so, however, he entangles himself in certain difficulties. For one thing, he initially gives the impression that the market, without any further provisions, is able to coordinate the private interest of all its citizens in a manner conducive to the formation of an ethical community. But later on, in the very same chapter, he points to the necessity of supplementary institutions such as trade control authorities, the police, and corporations, without which a communization of private egoistic activities would in fact be possible. Hegel, in addition, in the course of his efforts to bring ethical order to the market, Hegel admits quite openly that he knows of no just solution to the problem of overproduction and the poverty it regularly produces, except that is for the recommendation of creating additional markets in the economy. Considering all these contradictions and stopgap solutions, it is hardly surprising that the reception history of this chapter of the philosophy of life has seen the development of three highly divergent perspectives. Some understand Hegel's reflections on the market economy as a statement of his conclusion that modern ethical life cannot ultimately form totality because the private capitalist economy will always inhabit it as a foreign substance. Others interpret the chapter as the upshot of a failed attempt on Hegel's part to demonstrate by means of various conceptual maneuvers the possibility of containing the market, at the cost, to be sure, of certain inconsistencies. And the third strand of interpretation reads Hegel's remarks in this chapter as a collection of highly instructive proposals which, however, require further development. If they are to offer anything like Hegel's structure or ethically embedded economic system that enables individual freedom on all sides. But very close to Hegel and deeply convinced of the enduring significance of his work, Hegel belonged early on to the third of these three groups. He believed that program of rendering the economic sphere as a subsystem of ethical life had been unsuccessful, offering no adequate solution to the impoverishment of the working population that was already unwilling to do. In the preface to his edition of Hegel's philosophy of life, After explaining the intention behind the lectures and certain editorial principles, Gans then notes that the ongoing development of social reality would soon demand a revision of the ideas formulated in the work, albeit on the basis, I quote, of the same foundational principles. The changed circumstances Gans had in mind were doubtless associated with the increasing importance of the social question. And in noting that this would have to be resolved in view, but on the basis of the same foundational principles, Gans was surely referring to Hegel's intention to comprehend the economic sphere as an ethical system of social cooperation and freedom. In trying to determine how to retain this Hegelian principle, whilst conceiving an economic order that would no longer rest upon growth, inequality, and the arbitrary whims of private capital, Gans now mobilizes certain essential ideas of Saint-Simonism. In his autobiographical recollections, in which he reports extensively on his many encounters and conversations with the leading intellectuals of the day, he begins by listing the factors that separated him from the jealous followers of the French social theorists. He is especially critical of their intention of letting the economy be entirely absorbed into the state, by having almost religiously concentrated central planning authority take over the market's function of harmonizing economic activity between different individuals. True to the basic principles of his teacher, Hegel, he argues that this economic vision would once again rob individuals of their freedom, the granting of which had been the great achievement of modernity over antiquity. But following this reckoning with the Saint-Simonists, in the very next paragraph, Gans directs his comments against Hegel. Market competition may by no means become so unconstrained that the health, enjoyment of life, and that the whole existence of an entire class, this is partly a quote, would be sacrificed to the service of an individual, which is the capitalist entrepreneur. And in the still more vehement tone, Gans immediately poses the rhetorical question of whether we should not call it slavery, I quote, where men are exploited like animals, even if they would otherwise be free to die of hunger, end of quote. Sounds like Marx. In attempting to answer the difficult question of how to retain market-based competition whilst removing economic exploitation and the tyrannical arbitrariness of the capitalist, Gans now argues on the basis of a further guiding economic principle of Saint-Simonism. Reversing the direction of his previous line of argument, he now praises the members of this school for reviving the ideas of the old guilds and thereby devising the sole contemporary means for enabling the working population to take on the power of capital on an equal footing. In a passage worth citing at some length, Gans expresses his solidarity with the early socialists, making abundantly clear how he seeks to move with Hegel beyond Hegel. And I quote, with the guilds, the Middle Ages possessed an organic institution for labor. The guilds are destroyed and cannot be re-established. But should liberated labor now lapse from the cooperation into despotism, from the rule of the master craftsman to that of the factory owner, if there are no means to combat this development? There certainly is. It is the free cooperation, it is communization. End of quote. To be sure, it remains somewhat unclear what exactly Gans means with his reference to the necessary communization of the market. But the context nonetheless makes explicit that he has in mind something significantly more substantial than that which Hegel intended to invoke in his corporations. For Hegel, corporations were to have the compensatory function of integrating workers into various professional and commercial organizations. This would both help them maintain the consciousness of their role in the overall division of labor and secure their basic welfare in cases of unemployment and sickness. Gans' ambitions by contrast, were significantly more active. He connected corporations or associations, as he liked to call them, with the idea of equipping workers with a certain agency through their integration into professional groups. Participation in such groups should ensure that they have a voice and decision-making power equal to that of their respective employees. When it came to wage settlements or disputes over working hours or working conditions. If I wanted to encapsulate the difference between Hegel and his students' understanding of the task of the corporation in contemporary terminology, one would say that whereas the author of the philosophy of life had in mind emergency associations or communities of solidarity, Gans envisioned something much more like militant trade unions. Gans' relatively sparse comments made it hard to determine whether he even wanted to go a step further and hand over ownership of the means of production to the corporations so that they would function rather like cooperatives. Had he envisaged such a measure, one might quite cautiously describe this program as an early blueprint for a form of market socialism. But setting this question aside, it is nonetheless clear that one of Hegel's own students set about trying to develop these partly contradictory, partly incomplete reflections on ethically re-embedding the market in the direction of a liberal socialist program. Gans insists that if we are to do justice to Hegel's goal of thinking of the economy as a site of the realization of social freedom, the de facto powerlessness of the working class means more is required than a mere nod in the direction of regulatory bodies and the necessity of profession-based communities of solidarity. In his view, the real communization of the market could ensure ethical embedding of the economy within society only on the condition that workers participate in economic decision-making processes on an equal footing. We can therefore conclude that according to Gans, Hegel's legacy for political philosophy could have meaningful contemporary application only if the working class were granted the maximally extensive right of co-determination within the capitalist marketplace. Second, moving over from Germany, I now want to turn to a different intellectual scene in which Hegel's ideas were also developed in the direction of a reformist socialism. In England, at the turn of the 20th century, however, it was not his rather incomplete economic ideas, but rather his philosophical concept of social freedom, which encouraged certain authors to radicalize his political aims. The first generation of this school included first and foremost T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, and Bernard Bossack, whilst the second generation included, amongst others, G.H. Murray and G.M.E. McTaggart. Their starting point was a critique of the empiricism that had long dominated British thought. Drawing on Kant and Hegel, they accused this tradition of making human reason causally dependent on the natural order. While their particular aims differed, each of the thinkers began to consider whether and to what extent philosophy might justifiably begin with the idea of reason's constitutive primacy in understanding the entirety of our relation to the world. In the fields of political ethics and social philosophy, to which almost all of the British idealists made substantial contributions, this goal meant offering a proof that under normal conditions, our actions are guided by the will to realize an ideal I, which obeys the rational principles of the common good. At this point, however, most followed Hegel rather than Kant, working on the premise that such moral ideals of individual self-realization are to be derived not from the perspective of an isolated subject, but only from the ethical contents of an actuality that had already been rendered present. On this account, what the individual usually strives for, what he ideally seeks to achieve in life, can be read off the institutional order of a given society on the condition that these correspond for their part to the standards of an historically unfolding reason. Thus far, to be sure, this all sounds like a faithful rendering of the letter of Hegel's philosophy of life, so much that one might then ask why the politically engaged British Hegelians felt impelled to radicalize Hegel's concern. The idea that the standards of intellectual conduct must be extracted from a given social reality, insofar as that reality counts as sufficiently rational and accordingly as conducive to the general well-being, was not exactly new. It was a principle shared by all Hegelians at the time. The British idealist reason for moving this Hegel beyond Hegel and radicalizing his philosophy of right in the direction of a socialist reformism did not arise simply from these basic premises of an idealism of reason. Rather, it sprang from the insight that actually fulfilling the social conditions on individual ethics and self-regulation in the contemporary world would require setting society with considerably more responsibilities than Hegel envisaged. But in order to understand where and how they thus differed from Hegel, it is worth recalling how Hegel conceives the institutional conditions of individual freedom. As is well known, Hegel's conception of the presuppositions of actualizing individual freedom was more expensive than that of almost anything before it. Amongst these presuppositions, he counted not only, like Locke, the egalitarian distribution of basic liberal rights, and not only, like Rousseau and Kant, the universal right of individual self-determination, but also, and above all, the positive capacity to participate in the shaping of the foundational institutions of society. This last institutional element of individual freedom seemed indispensable to him. He saw it as the sole means of ensuring that each individual is able to realize his or her personality by a mutual recognition with other participants in socially institutionalized practices. To this extent, Hegel's political ethics made individual self-determination dependent on a certain presupposition, namely active incorporation into social institutions where these have to be sufficiently rational to be experienced as sites of the cognitive satisfaction of one's own goals and wishes. With this institutional term, the author of the philosophy of right became the founder of a tradition in which social justice was essentially thought of not in terms of the bundle of personal rights, but of the actual capacity to participate and shape an institutionally regulated communal life without coercion and with equal rights. Nevertheless, Hegel's conception of the legal and institutional presuppositions that would in fact have to be fulfilled in his own day in order for individuals to thus be rendered capable of self-determination was rather inadequate and vague. He restricted himself to indicating how the conditions of self-determination would encompass membership in a family founded on love and care, participation in a state-regulated market, and finally, membership of a politically active citizen. Yet he altogether neglects the question of whether squalid living conditions, oppressive, highly dependent labor conditions, or lack of education might not only hinder active participation in these freedom-enabling institutions, but render access to them entirely impossible. The problem that certain people might simply be unable to participate in established spheres of the intersubjective realization of individual freedom, that they might lack the basic requisite qualifications, only makes an apparent when he discusses the marginal example of the rebel. But he never thinks of it as a problem that might affect the great mass of the working population. And at no point are Hegel's sociological idealizations and disregard for the condition of the lower social classes more pronounced than in those passages they simply, as though stating the obvious, would have women excluded from all activities beyond the domain of the household and the family. In a rather striking failure to recognize the social reality of large swaths of the population, in which the gainful employment of women was utterly common, he believed that their actual abilities allowed them to enjoy the freedom of social self-realization solely through the love of their husbands and children. It is these obvious deficiencies of Hegel's philosophy of life that the British idealists of the Victorian era began to confront. They certainly agreed with his philosophy's fundamental premise that freedom needs to be grasped as a positive capacity to achieve rational self-actualization through active participation in the shaping of the central institutions of social life. But they also worked on the further premise that these required substantially more in the way of social equality and the elimination of social disadvantage than Hegel had envisaged in his own political ethics. The British idealists thus sought to transcend the imaginative horizon of Hegel's own thinking, and their starting point was their particular way of taking up the idea of institutional conditions of individual freedom. This boiled down to the thesis that rational self-actualization demands of each member of society that they fulfill the elementary duties imposed upon them by their respective social roles. At the same time, however, they also believe that any justified expectation of making such a contribution to social cooperation was conditional on the task involved being relatively evenly distributed, universally accessible, and requiring comparable expenditures of effort. All the British idealists agree that once these three social presuppositions were met, once, that is, social cooperation was organized in a sufficiently fair and just manner, the gaining interplay between individual self-actualization and general welfare could be established. Each would of his or her own rational volition do exactly what, in combination with the equally voluntary and rational doings of others, would serve the well-being of the society as a whole. Unlike Hegel, however, they precisely did not believe that the social conditions of such a fair and just organization of social cooperation were already met by the given conditions of social existence. In their view, one simply could not expect people to seek their happiness in all of all things, the fulfillment of their socially imposed duties, when social reality was so deeply shaped by an unregulated market, the unequal distribution of wealth, and a hierarchically structured educational system. Consequently, they affirmed the unconditional necessity of a series of social reforms. Reforms that would first create the presuppositions on which citizens could in fact understand their own self-realization as a contribution to the common good. Each of the British idealists had their own views as to which measures they were required, reflecting their individual temperaments and political sensibility. But almost all of the members of this circle, however, advocated the moral socialism, arguing first and foremost for a highly unified open educational system which would provide every member of society with a real opportunity to enter into a profession corresponding to their own talents and expectations. In the second place, they were deeply exercised by the state of social working conditions. Many of the representatives of British idealism, in fact, suspected that under the conditions of capitalist production, labor was simply too poorly remunerated, too intellectually unstimulating, and too burdensome on the individuals to give all employees the fair chance of exercising their rights to social participation. The third preoccupation amongst this group was the English electoral law. They regarded this as unjust, and on account of its continuing to deny women the vote, regressive. These restrictions of the franchise excluded women in a decisive respect from participation in social life, banishing them to the private ranks of the domestic kitchen and the nursery. Considering these reforming intentions as a whole, it is not a surprise that the British idealists are now seen by many historians as providing an intellectual impulse for the founding of the Labour Party in 1900. One of the ones who is defending this idea is especially Bernard Williams, who always said British idealists are the founders of the Labour Party. It is commonly thought that besides political suggestions from the Fabian society, it was above all the ideas of T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, and Bernard Besant that found their way into the first program of this organization of the workers' movement. A program that focused strongly on originality, that is Kant. The whole idea that the moral will is, in that sense, the self-restrained will, that it determines itself by reference to practical norms or practical principles that can be reaffirmed out of reason. So I think this motive is constitutive for any practical philosophy coming from Kant, but trying to give it more substance. And this is what Hegel is doing. And there are two steps on the way from Kant to Hegel in this regard. The first question is how to explain the self-restrainment. And for Kant, this is a task or an endeavor that the individual, he imagines the individual himself or herself is capable of carrying out. Yeah? It is the individual that has to restrain itself by its obedience to the moral law. I think Hegel first took from Fichte the idea that this self-restrainment of the will is only possible with the help of the other. Yeah? It is based on mutual recognition. Only mutual recognition allows this kind of self-restraint. Yeah? So, and it has to be thought of as being mutual. Yeah? So they overcome solipsism, if you want so, by an intersubjective model that allows them to understand the mechanism of this self-restrainment difference. And then the second step Hegel is taking is filling this self-restrainment with social stuff, if you want so. Yeah? Heavily with social stuff. Because Hegel believes there is not one mode of self-restraint, maybe the moral self-restraint, but that there are different modes of such self-restraint or self-inclination, yeah, self-restraint of our will, stemming from the ethical borders you are embedded in. I mean, this is the central idea in the British idealism, yeah? Which means you have these two steps. First, you go over to switching from solipsism to intersubjectivism, and then in the second move, you ask yourself how exactly to explain the norms and the principles that we take as the source of restraining our will. And on this second point, I think Hegel almost becomes a sociologist, yeah, because, and that is close to Durkheim, because Durkheim would do exactly and propose exactly the same thing. What norms we take as allowing us this intersubjective processment of self-restrainment of our will. Those norms are depending on the institutional subsystems in which I am involved. Under the condition I can infer it. So the norms within the family are completely different from the norms within the political community, and these all are very specific norms, and he ethical norms that count for us as sources for this kind of self-esteem. So I think I completely agree with you on the central point, yeah, that what is specific, I mean, also in difference to many other philosophical practical traditions. Yeah, if you take if you take Smith, yeah, who is a real counterpart in a very interesting opponent, let's say, to the tradition I am now interested in. But what makes it specific in the German tradition is this idea that the self-retainment of will is something that does not come from our nature, probably Smith, probably you, from certain sentiments we have deeply inbuilt in our nature, but it must come from some practical capacity we have. And this practical capacity is then explained in very different versions by either Kant and then by Fichte and then by Hegel. So I think we both agree on the central, the centrality this idea has for Hegel thinking.
Thank you. There's one last question, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what is the justification for using the term socialism, and I mean really in that place the historic justification and not the systematic one. I think certainly there is justification with regard to Kant, since he is referring to Saint-Simon, to early socialism, but so my doubt is that this is the case also with regard to the British idealists. As far as I know, they are not talking about socialism, but about so-called social liberalism or new liberalism. At least scholars who are interpreting the political philosophy of British idealists are spelling it out in terms of new liberalism or social liberalism. And all the features you mentioned with regard to the British idealists, like, for example, an inclusive, equal educational system, like fair social cooperation, are actually features of a classical, if you want, social democratic program. So what is the difference between a social liberal approach and what is more with regard to a socialist, prospective socialist program, again, perhaps with regard to the British idealist in this particular case?
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess I have to be short. Yeah? The easiest answer, but an answer I will not give, would be to say that all the three authors or currents I was referring to are equally using the notion socialism for identifying their own program. Yeah? So this is true for the British idealists. They called their own endeavor moral socialism. It is true for Durkheim, who called himself at the end of his life a socialist. So that would be a very easy answer. Yeah? So this explains probably why I have good reasons to refer to these three currents of these three groups as being unified by an idea of liberal socialism. Now, I think the systematic question which makes it more difficult is what's the difference between social liberalism and socialism? I call it liberal socialism. Now, I'm not sure about it, to tell you the truth. I don't know exactly what social liberalism means. Yeah? What we know from the past with regard to liberalism are two very different kinds of liberalism. We know the kind of economic liberalism, and we know what that means. Yeah? It is the stream or the current that believes that they can mobilize Smith for arguing for unrestricted power if they are unfair to Smith, but that's economic emphasizes the political domain, and one example would be for this kind of political liberalism would not to be found in the German tradition, I think. If you would have to go to England and to the United States, where the central idea is that all citizens should have completely unrestricted right to political participation, so that it will be political rights which are in the center of such a kind of political liberalism. I don't know of a liberalism that is out of its own intellectual source interested in the social domain and in social rights and in the social goods that are of highest concern for this socialist tradition. So I wouldn't mind to call what I called socialism, to call it social liberalism. I would prefer the emphasis to be not on liberalism but on socialism, and that has a lot to do with understanding the original meaning of what was meant with socialism. Yeah? Socialism in the beginning, if you think of the early socialists, it simply meant something I think Hegel wanted to tell us, namely that a society to become truly social. I think that's an Hegelian intuition, but it was already shared by the early socialists. A society to become really social is in need of social cooperation. So it is not sufficient to think of it in terms of individual rights. It needs, upon this, it needs an emphasis on the social in that sense, namely, and the social I translate normally into social cooperation. What allows every member of a society to be collectively able to participate in shaping the institutions. I think that's the original intuition of socialism. And that goes over and transcends, I think, the tradition, if there is a tradition of political liberalism. I hope that answers a little bit your question.
Thank you so much, Professor Hornell, for joining us today.
Just in case.
Presentation for our doing and translator
Ok, salut, ça va. Tu comprends là? Tu comprends là? Oui, tu parles. Ouais. Écoute, on a grand retour. Bonne chance. Fais aller le à 3. Marco,
Figure, or can he really break out of this limitations, and what Hegel would think about this? But it's definitely a fascinating reading, because one which should have literary scholars here. I think Diderot's text destabilize to an extent these very simple ideas or ideas of enlightenment. He questioned them himself, and that's the genius, and also in terms of form as well. It's extremely radical. It's always playful. It's almost never serious. It does not lend itself to simple moral conclusions like Voltaire was doing, right? Yes, I mean, there's this, we in Georgia in the 18th century Enlightenment forms. Interesting, very interesting. One of his sentences is that the knowledge will give you the understanding where I'm from, who you are, and where I'm going. And what we seem to do in life is faith, right? And then the same questions are asked, and the answers that you will give are, of course, extremely ironic and kind of almost cynical. So this the second layer, which hard to safe for me now in which precise relationships, philosophy, it's like completely projects, literary projects are, but they are definitely not that significant. That's what I can say at this point.
Well, we've already run out of time, but we can squeeze in one tiny question.
Thank you.
I was lost at several points because I think you go from abstract to concrete to back to abstract and concrete. One of the points that I was lost was about Mozart, for example, as Norbert Elias speaks about that. So how do you interpret that? For example, the existence of Mozart as a personal societal part? Thank you.
Well, that is a fascinating question which I'm not sure I can answer now. I mean, that would be, of course, a great project to read Hegel and Mozart alongside each other. But I'm not ready to do it at this point. But yeah, we should do that.
Centralized economy. I think most of us would agree upon the idea that the future economy that is supposed to be more fair, more inclusive, and giving much more power to the working classes would be something like a mixed economy, constituted out of different elements that were established, let's say, in the last 200 years in the history of capitalism. So it would entail, for sure, cooperatives, which means corporations owned by workers. It would not be able without the market. It would also include elements of a planned economy, for example, with regard to all public goods. So I think in order to find out what the right mixture of these different constituent elements could be, it needs, if there would be a party, let's say, determined enough to engage in such experiments, to start with small-scaled experiments where we try how it could work. For example, I could imagine that, and France did it in its socialist past, that the state would reserve money for corporations, which means worker-owned industries or companies, in order to figure out where the problems exactly sit. Yeah? And there will be a lot of problems. We know that. We know that from the past. So I think that is my reliance on social experimentalism. The whole idea is to overcome this strange situation in which we are, where socialism is sort of only in two terms, either in the Marxist way, namely without clear idea of how to organize a future economy, but with the idea of a revolutionary overcoming of the market. And I think we do not know any longer what that exactly means, yeah? To simply overcome the market. Nobody of us knows. So I think we should get rid of this idea. We should also get rid of the idea that socialism, or village socialism, is not in need of any institutional or sociological entities. Yeah? That's the danger of what is very often called moral socialism. And moral socialism then is very often connected or associated with Kant's legacy. So as if you can reconstruct socialism on the basis of Kant's practical furtherance. I don't believe that. I think it needs much more sociological institutional fantasy in order to recreate the socialism that is capable of inspiring people again, and especially inspiring us and giving us certain visions on how to overcome a deeply unfair capitalist market with all the deficiencies it has. So I hope I have connected the two questions.
Thank you. We have a further question by Theo Bohr.
of Bonn. Some weeks ago, we had a meeting in Bochum, perhaps you can remember. I would like to say that I agree with your main thesis, that the source of the modern socialism is the philosophy of Hegel. But I would like to ask you if it could be a more special view on this philosophy. So, the main thesis of the real in Hegel is the idea of a self-restraint. And we have it also in other idealistic things. And for this background, the market must become important for Hegel. And therefore, the idea of organization as cooperation von Ivan Ilin, das wahrscheinlich der selber ein definitiv Hegelianer war, aber natürlich auf Hegel beruht sich jetzt nicht gar nicht. Aber dass diese Verbindung existiert, ist interessant, weil man könnte ein Essay schreiben, und sagen, okay, es gab so eine französisch-russische Interpretation von Hegel in der Figur von Roger, der dann die Philosophie aufgegeben hat und dann als Beamte die